Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Eurofund Ask the Expert webinar. Today's webinar is going to be on the subject of how to help workers struggling with inflation. Thank you for signing up and joining us today. And as you know, you can follow us live and join the conversation. You can also follow us on YouTube, where the webinar will be played out simultaneously. My name is Mary McCaughey. I'm Head of Information and Communication here at Eurofund, and we are delighted today to be able to bring together three of our key experts from Eurofund to discuss this very pertinent topic. Together, we are going to look at the impacts of inflation on pay in real terms across Europe, and we're going to look at how this is likely to develop over the coming months. We want to also speak a little bit about the broader societal implications of declining purchasing power and the role of public services, of course, in building resilience across the EU at a time like this. We've all seen the impacts of inflation over the last period, and hopefully we're beginning to see this ease a little. And with the European Commission's spring economic forecast projecting that EU inflation will fall to 6.7% in 2023 from the 9.2% it was at in 2022. It's also projecting that it will ease to about 3.1% in 2024. So that may be good news. It might look as if inflation is going to have peaked for the foreseeable future. We do know that the European Central Bank has warned that inflation will remain too high for too long. And this is particularly the case for core inflation, which of course excludes energy prices. We know from Eurofund's own analysis that the risk of recession has subsided, but that inflation continues to erode the purchasing power of households, workers and consumers. Data which was published at the beginning of this year shows that despite significant increases in nominal rates between 22 and 23, minimum wage workers in most EU countries are still seeing their purchasing power decline, with increases in real terms in just a few member states. That being said, while of course this current inflationary situation is clearly making it difficult for real minimum wages to keep up, minimum wages have increased over the past 10 years in most member states. Equally, Eurofund has also published a report earlier this month on tackling rising inflation and sectoral collective wage bargaining. And this report shows that workers across some sectors are experiencing declining purchasing power, and that this has the potential to again increase poverty rates and possibly social conflict, industrial action, labour disputes. In the long term, of course, this could potentially jeopardise social cohesion and indeed the EU's strategic goals for the twin green and digital transition. So it's obvious that inflation has featured prominently as a result on the political agenda, and governments have enacted extensive relief packages, which largely are aimed at mitigating the impact of this inflation and the inflationary rises on households and families, on sectors, and those on the lowest incomes. Fiscal measures, tax reductions, support for energy bills have been used extensively to try and offset this crisis. But these measures are usually temporary, although they have been extended quite significantly ongoing. However, we do know that the long-term use of this was going to have an impact on social services, which provide the kind of vital support that we need in society, and particularly again for those who are most vulnerable and who are struggling financially. So is it all bad news, or do we actually have some solutions to the problem? Today's discussion, we hope, will look at the various tools and issues which are at play and ask, is there another way? Are there things we are missing? Can workers receive the support they need without compromising on the effectiveness or the availability of public services? And how exactly can we or will we do this? Today's Eurofund experts are today's panelists, and I'm delighted to let them join me because they will tell us the detail of what I have outlined above. We have Senior Research Manager Christine Aumayr-Pintar, who's from the Working Life Unit here in Eurofund. We have our Head of Unit, Tadas Leončikas, from the Employment Unit, and we have Research Manager Ricardo Rodríguez Contreras, also from the Working Life Unit. So welcome to the three of you this morning. I'm very happy that you're able to join. And for those of you who have logged in and joined us this morning and who are our regular audience, you know that Eurofound is an EU agency whose role is to provide knowledge to assist in the development of better social, employment and work-related policies. You also know that part of our role is to have these kind of discussions and provide the fora for debate to talk with the experts about the knowledge that we have in Eurofound and share it with those who are interested. So I invite you please to join the chat online and ask our experts during our discussion any questions you may have about the discussion and the topic that we will cover today. And we will integrate them into our discussion during the course of this webinar. You can also follow us, of course, on all the social media channels, and we are encouraging you greatly to do so. So to start us off, Ricardo, I've talked enough, you are the expert. Can you really help us to set the scene here? I mean, we know that wages are important at all times, but I suppose never more so than at a time of high inflation when purchasing power is being eroded. How has the wage bargaining system responded to the high inflation situation and has managed to keep up? Ricardo, you might just like to unmute yourself. Yeah, perfect.
It's okay. Can you hear me now?
Excellent. Yeah.
Good morning again. So as it's well known, inflation started to gradually increase in the second half of 2021. Then inflation in the European Union accelerated in 2022 and is still remaining high in 2023. Then inflation is back, unfortunately, and even it is expected to slowly decline, as you said before, by 2025. The projections forecast that price growth is said to be and will be persistent in the medium term. These high inflation rates, of course, have impacted and still are impacted and impacting collective bargaining rounds. Must be said that nominal wages have increased, even in some countries significantly, during 2022. So, but also we should say that there are differences that across countries that reflect, of course, different inflation rates. In 2022, according to the Spring Commission forecast, nominal wages grew close to 5% in the European Union, and it is expected to grow close to 6% in 2023. However, real wages declined in many member states, particularly in those with higher inflation rates. So obviously it means that workers across the European Union have suffered losses in purchasing power. Regarding collective bargaining, first of all, we should say that there are many differences among collective bargaining, collective wages bargaining systems and pay setting mechanisms across member states and particularly across sectors. So however, overall negotiated wages have struggled to keep up with inflation. This is already recognized with inflation rates, mostly growing slower than inflation. We have conducted an in-depth analysis of collective wage agreements in 4 sectors, chemical and pharmaceutical, metalworking, and hospitality and domestic work in 3 countries, France, Germany, and Italy. These collective agreements were signed up in 2022 or by the end of 2021, so precisely when inflation started to be noticed or even had started to escalate abruptly. Again, in most cases, wage growth has remained below inflation, affecting mainly low-income groups, and even with, as I said before, nominal wages pick up in 2021 and 2022. In this specific sectoral analysis, it's hard to estimate the real wage increase in each sectoral collective agreement, because mainly wage increases have been accompanied by one-off payments in order to compensate purchasing power, the loss of purchasing power. The data that we have got suggests that there have been more significant increases in the collective agreements in the services sector, which is something surprisingly to some extent. But and because these sectors are basically characterized by lower productivity, lower skills, even lower because union membership is relatively weak in these sectors, and of course, weak collective bargaining coverage. Then these increases should be considered somehow exceptional. Mainly because we also have found that in the negotiations, new drivers such as labor shortages have shown up. It can maybe significantly it can influence sectoral collective bargaining, and then this is the reason why this has led to higher wage outcomes. This is interesting because it's generally stressed that labor shortages are rather connected with jobs linked to green and the digital transition. But however, there are activities in the services sector that are also experiencing labor shortages, particularly in lower paid jobs. This is consistent with other strands of Eurofound research in minimum wages, etc., etc. But just to conclude, to say that with wage rates, as you said before, tensions may surface in social dialogue and collective bargaining over the coming years.
Right. So I suppose in some ways, I think we should come back at a later stage to the issue of labor shortages and how that is linked, Ricardo. But I mean, here, Christine, we've seen that different collective wage bargaining systems have reacted in a way differently during this inflation hike, but it would still seem that wages have grown, but they haven't grown enough to keep up with the inflation hikes. And not only that, it would seem that those in low-income groups seem to be the most affected. Is there something that can be done to target the paid groups at this time? Would increasing the minimum wage, have we seen that to be an effective response in some countries at least?
Yeah, thank you, Mary, for this question. And obviously, following on from what Ricardo has said, collective bargaining is very important for wage setting in the EU. But we also need to bear in mind that there's really a huge variation in how many workers are covered by collective bargaining agreements in the member states. So, on the one end of the scale, you have nearly all employees covered in countries such as Austria, Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, many, more than 80% in Sweden, still very high in Denmark, etc. So for those workers, collective bargaining rounds matter very much for workers in those countries. However, if you look at the other range of the scale, we see that only around every fifth worker or even less is covered by collective bargaining in the Baltic member states, Hungary or Romania. So especially in those countries, it's much more important to look at the statutory minimum wages if we're talking about how low-paid workers are feeling the recession. And Mary, you've already mentioned that in your introductory remarks, but just to stress it again, that over the past decades, minimum wage workers in most EU member states have really benefited a lot in various ways from increases in their minimum wages. The purchasing power has increased in real terms. Their gross wages grew more than average wages or median wages, and very often at higher rates than labor productivity growth. So over the past decade, there was really good news for minimum wage earners, or relatively good news, because often they also started from relatively low levels. That also has to be mentioned in this context. But now when we look at the most recent impacts, so say if we look at the last year between starting on 1st January 2022 up to 1st January 2023, because of this high inflation, many member states have really increased the statutory minimum wages substantially. And if I say substantially, it is really significant. So the median increase in the member states with the statutory minimum wage was nominally 11%, compared with 5% between 2021 and 2022. So more than double the percentage increase in nominal terms. But, and here comes the but, even with this very high strong increases, and also depending on how we measure inflation. But we can see that in most countries, this was barely enough or not enough to maintain the purchasing power. And also, as we know that inflation is here to stay and continues throughout the year, 2023, the value of statutory minimum wages declined again. So coming back to this good news of the past decade, so far we have not seen yet that the purchasing power loss has eroded the long-term gains, but we need to be very careful and watch this space, that the minimum wage setters in the countries need to do that, to see that these decade-long gains are not eroded now.
So Christine, what you're saying is it has been a relatively good news story in terms of, the purchasing power for minimum wage workers, etc., and that this has not yet been eroded by the inflationary hikes. However, would this be a kind of a pivotal moment? I mean, are we asking policymakers to really take note, because this is the time where things could change and it becomes no longer a good news story?
Exactly. And statutory minimum wages are really the main central tool for wage setters to play with, and also with an impact then exerting on collectively agreed wages or actual wages. So what the central wage setters do, that will be looked upon by other actors in the field.
And Christine, what can they do, or what have they done that's going in that right direction, if you like?
Yeah. So last year, we saw really multiple approaches in the EU. For example, Germany and the Netherlands, they have provided really substantial and ad hoc increases of the minimum wages. So Germany went from a bit more than 10 euros up to 12 euros. In Germany, this was not specifically and initially connected to addressing inflation. It was more, politically motivated step promised already pre-election. However, it really came just at the right time in the context of rising inflation. Netherlands have a very fixed way of setting the minimum wages, very rule-based, linking it to actual wages. And for the first time since they have introduced the minimum wage, I think for the first time since the 1960s, they have deviated from that rule and have provided a very substantial ad hoc increase of more than 7.5%. Other countries, so for instance, Hungary. In Hungary, there were tripartite negotiations going on between the social partners and governments, and social partners have agreed that they would do an additional update of the statutory minimum wage during the year if inflation is higher than 18%. So far, this has not turned out to be the case. There's still discussion on how to measure inflation, but in principle, they would have foreseen such a mid-year update.
Okay.
In Poland is a relatively similar case, with the difference that such a mid-year update is prescribed in law. So if inflation is above a certain threshold, 5% in that case, government has to give another update. And this has happened already in Poland. And then we have countries like Belgium, France, and Luxembourg, which have, again, a very specific system of minimum wage setting. They use so-called automatic indexation mechanisms. And this is also enshrined in laws. And this mechanism really links the development of statutory minimum wages to the developments in consumer prices in different ways. So especially in Belgian workers on the minimum wage, they have really received several updates within the last year, because inflation was over a certain threshold. Luxembourg did alter this mechanism a little bit last year. There would have been 2 such automatic updates, but there was a decision made with the social partners in a tripartite agreement to postpone the second increase. And that was motivated by ensuring that employers should have more predictability about the development of statutory minimum wages. And On the other hand, the reason why trade unions agreed on that was that government stepped in for this postponed increase and provided income support for the workers. And this is also what we've seen across many other countries. So we've mapped a lot of policies responding to inflation, and we saw that many of the member states, instead of only relying on the wage increases, they provided support measures for workers, but also for citizens and companies, and which helped them to ease the burden of the growing prices.
But these measures, most of the time, I suppose, Christine, were not targeted only at minimum wage workers. They would have been a wider group or a wider cohort that were being targeted to include other citizens. And what kind of measures would we be talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, Mary, that's correct. So most often they were really addressed at households, reducing energy bills, providing general financial support, so not necessarily linked to energy bills, sometimes food vouchers. Sometimes this was done directly, giving people cash in their bank accounts. Sometimes it came via tax deductions. Okay. And also we saw that because these measures had to be rolled out very fast, many countries opted to do it in a non-targeted way, but to give it, for all households across the board, not means tested. And if they were targeted, they targeted the more vulnerable groups, like families with children, low-income households, pensioners, etc. Yeah. I presume I can hand over to Tadas at this point, because that ties in nicely.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that's a kind of natural link then with the whole aspect of social assistance and the benefits program. I mean, I suppose, Tadas, we've heard about wage setting, we've talked about minimum wage, and we've seen how they can play a role. And also, in fact, in the last part that Christine was talking about there, also other measures that governments have introduced sort of on an ad hoc basis to target, particular aspects like energy bills, etc. When we're looking at this, though, and we really are looking at what can be done to help workers and citizens in general to ease the inflation crisis, I suppose we have to integrate the social assistance and benefits element as part of this package. Can you talk to us a little bit about what steps have been taken to address it in the current crisis?
Indeed, fair wages is critical, and especially that's the topic in the focus of today's discussion. But rising cost of living affected people also who are not in employment. So families of the workers, but also other social groups beyond employment were affected. And it is important that governments paid attention. EU provided considerable support for member states to make sure that social groups in difficulties were assisted. So what we have, the basic facts to remember, is that EU in a short period of a few years underwent two huge social challenges. So COVID pandemic first, and then the rising cost of living. And the latter was exacerbated by the even greater danger, Russia's war in the east of the European Union. So the way member states and EU dealt with that was, first of all, ensuring allowances, different types of tax and fiscal measures to make sure that utility cost burden was manageable. And a lot of utilities, well, that comes down mostly to electricity and heating, but also transport costs increased, etc. So these types of services are referred to as essential services in the European Pillar of Social Rights. Here we come to see the importance of deepening the social dimension in the EU policymaking. And as Christina said, a lot of these measures, in order to be introduced and rolled out quickly, were universal, applied across the board. Now, in 2023, we are at the moment when a lot of those measures are being winded down, removed, or planned to be diminished, if not entirely removed. So it's a critical moment to have tools to identify which groups suffer or encounter difficulties, to make sure that support is targeted and targeted effectively. But in the broad background of these last 3 years or so, we have to also realize that EU as a whole and its individual member states were quite successful in managing this burden. So if you look at social protection mechanisms, social assistance tools, at a broad EU-wide picture, what we can notice that minimum income thresholds have been raised in a number of countries. EU is debating now further how to ensure adequacy of minimum incomes. Large group of older citizens, pensioners. In the first year of the pandemic, we saw that pensions didn't grow as fast as the wages. However, pensions have not been cut, and scheduled increases also took places across a number of member states. The percentage of GDP that was spent on unemployment benefits increased considerably in the first year of the pandemic, when we had the general economic slowdown. And it was staying high in 2021, the second year of the pandemic, and so on. So compared to the years before. So a lot has been done to assist workers, first of all, in preserving their jobs. And now we speak about further developments around wages. But other groups beyond workers were also assisted. Disability benefits increased as a percentage of GDP. Catch up in supporting family services, fact, has been slower, and we know that's important. However, that also has increased in terms of support provided from 20 to 21. So that's a whole array of measures, and it's important that we focus on difficulties and prepare tools for tackling them. But we also need to see that we are in quite a confident background of a lot of tools rolled out. And as we focus on the most vulnerable, we also need to see the positive general background. In work poverty, one of the key challenges in regulating wages, adjusting them to be adequate, has been on a slow but declining trend since the aftermath of the financial crisis. If we speak about the averages of people reporting difficulties in making ends meet, it can sound counterintuitive, but the trend since the pandemic is also, the proportion of such people is declining on average. So it's important that we don't lose out from sight those who though need support. Energy poverty is a remaining challenge, and people who said that they could not keep their homes adequately warm, unfortunately has increased even when all these measures were rolled out across member states.
But Tadas, there, you know, again, in follow-up to Christine and her good news, if you like, on the sort of the maintaining the minimum wage levels and increasing them across the EU, and how they've kind of retained purchasing power. You're also talking about the increases and the efforts that were made in other areas in social assistance and social spending. But is it not true to say that, in fact, the economic climate and the tight labour markets that we talked about earlier also with Ricardo, that they were largely favourable for this kind of spending and also for the upward wage adjustments? So, but now we're looking at kind of a triple, if not a quadruple pronged, you know, crisis in terms of the war, in terms of the just transition, in terms of digitalization, you know, in terms of the cost. We're looking at so many elements that governments are going to have to take on board, and that's challenging for their ability to target the needs of the most vulnerable. I mean, what can you say to us about how things are looking in that context?
This is a huge question, of course. Maybe I will point to a few parameters to shape our thinking about these challenges. Well, it's a hot issue in the debate between economists. What are the implications of all these large support measures for public debt long term? In shorter term, however, I would emphasize that it's important that we don't fall into a trap of juxtaposing social expenditure vis-a-vis other needs, such as green transition, defense, and so on. The measures applied throughout the pandemic and then into the challenges around rising cost of living actually helped European societies to stay resilient. Basically to stay resilient during the pandemic and to quickly bounce back into economic growth and active participation in labor markets as soon as the pandemic began receding. And we have worldwide other countries that we can compare to that did not have this mechanism applied. The USA, for example, had much larger rise in unemployment, and we know the human costs associated with that. Another approach or idea to be aware about in European context is social investment. So social expenditure is not only a cost. It has a purpose. It helps people transit from life phases, from unemployment to employment, from education to work, to family, and so on. So that opens up another important area for policy making, and also another important dimension of European social model, public services, unmatched basically in the world context. So in this contemporary current situation of emerging challenges, support measures being winded down for energy bills and so on, we need to make sure that emerging cost barriers do not get in the way of people accessing key public services, and key public services such as including healthcare, childcare, schools, but also care services for people in need. Again, I can only point out high relevance, long-term relevance of the European pillar of social rights. The strength and social dimension in the EU has not been fully realized, I believe, so far. And accessing public services, apart from monetary dimension, is by no way an easy challenge to deal with. So beyond funding, there are challenges. In the pandemic, for example, we still have a backlog that accumulated in terms of unmet healthcare need. That was one area, for obvious reasons, access, social distancing, access to healthcare facilities was limited. And it was one challenge, one problem that kept accumulating after the first year of the pandemic. The level of unmet healthcare needs increased. So at the moment, we still have around 5% of families on lower income with children who have their healthcare needs unmet. So there are these aspects to also keep in mind, and make sure that access to services is ensured for those people who find this challenging in bad times as well as relatively good times, such as people with disabilities, people with care needs, carers with care responsibilities, and so on.
And we shouldn't forget, Tadas, in that context, when you talk about the availability and accessibility of good quality public services, that's what also helps build trust within society and amongst communities. And if we go back to what Ricardo mentioned earlier, if there's a danger of greater conflict and sort of disaffection as a result of this, then that's something that we certainly should focus on to ensure that we can offset any rise in that. And I want to take a few questions here, which are kind of related from the audience. There's a question, Ricardo, which I think I'll put to you. Has there been an increase in industrial action in the countries where workers have seen the greatest declines in purchasing power? We'll just unmute you again. Sorry, Ricardo.
Yeah. We don't have evidence of this increase, at least in 2022. Of course, there have some conflict, labor disputes in specific sectors during the negotiation of some collective bargaining rounds, but we cannot say that in 2022 there has been a dramatic increase of this social. It does not mean that it could happen in the future. It depends on how inflation rates are evolving and how all from on the one hand these shock absorbers that we could say about minimum wages, statutory minimum wages, or other support measures by governments can continue in the future.
So we're not seeing an immediate effect, but in fact, it could be that it's still in the mix as we look at things into the next period.
It is still, of course, a danger of such, but it's true that I think inflation rate escalated very quickly in 2022, and the collective agreements, collective bargaining as such is a heavy machinery. So it takes time to deal with all these external shocks. So the negotiating parties, of course, struggle. And of course, there are some, but it's true also that, as I said before, and all the extensive relief packages and support measures by the governments also contributed to cushion
yes, to cushion and protect. Yeah. I mean, a related question also, Tadas, with respect to what you raised about in-work poverty. There's a question from the audience which talks about the current trend of rising inflation and how that could it potentially undermine the positive trends in reducing work poverty over in-work poverty over the past decade? And you referenced that to some degree, but maybe you want to say a few words again?
Well, I can't agree more that it's definitely something to watch out for, to encourage policymakers be ready to apply tools for. But so far, the latest data we have about in-work poverty in the EU comes from 2022, so the previous year, and it had the lowest average figure since the aftermath of the financial crisis. However, I mean, there's no reason for complacency. So the latest figure was 8.5% of people of working population were in work poverty. And just to remind, in work poverty is a basically household measure. So it's an indication of people being in employment but not having sufficient household income to meet their needs or care responsibilities. So, well, it's under the figure of every 10th worker or their household, but still a considerable proportion of labor force. What is important also to watch out, even if the trend, a positive trend would continue, that's what we would wish for, is emerging challenges and new categories of workers that are appearing in the new gig economy. Underprotected workers related to platforms and similar types of jobs. So this is a particular segment of our labor force that we need to make sure is getting well integrated and fairly paid.
Okay, and a final question for the moment, which I'll put to Ricardo or Christine from Elvira, who's asking, would you recommend that wage increases keep up with inflation, automatic, in the future, so that workers do not lose purchasing power? Is there a fear of wage inflation spiral in that case? And how about companies' benefits? So there's sort of a 3-in-1 question there. I don't know if you want to share it. Ricardo, will I start with you?
Okay. First part of the question is about the recommendation, wages increases to keep up with inflation. Well, this is not a tendency that we have in the collective bargaining systems across member states. As I said at the very beginning, there are a lot of different approaches to pay settings. First of all, for example, indexation, formal indexation linking wages and inflation is banned, is forbidden in some countries, France, for example. So it is not a way in which collective bargaining is dealing with wage increases a long time ago. So the only examples that Christine mentioned before was Belgium, Luxembourg, and a couple of countries that are somehow linking directly the wages and inflation, but this is a minority. But it's true that what happens in practice is that at least at the sectoral level, there are some indirect ways in which wages are linked to inflation, and that multiple combination of possibilities in some countries. Exports reviews, for example, or many others. For example, as Christine also said before, the impact of statutory minimum wage is very important for low-paid group of workers. So I think mostly social partners do not agree with linking automatically wages and inflation. That's a reality. They prefer to have autonomy in order to negotiate what was at stake.
And the fear of a wage inflation spiral, I'm sure that's...
Well, so far it has not happened. It's true that we have had a lot of extensive relief packages. So the wage price spiral, that does not happen so far. It's a huge discussion also among economists. It's there. So this is something that we can see probably in a second wave. We'll see what happens, for example, when all these packages of relief will be retired will be soon. But so far, definitely has not been the case.
Okay, and maybe I can roll the company's benefits, the question there about how that company's benefits. And there's another question, which is how overall are businesses coping with increased wage demands? Maybe, Christine, can you say a few words on that? Of any use?
Not so much on this side, I'm afraid. I would have been in a position to answer the other two questions, which I found very relevant. So maybe I start with the have we seen increased strikes? And yes, Ricardo is absolutely right. We don't really have a good overview yet of increased strikes across the EU. However, we know that especially the countries where workers were most affected by purchasing power losses are also those countries where traditionally strike levels are very low. So I'm talking now about the Central and Eastern European member states, where in most countries there is no significant strike volume ongoing anyhow. And there might have been some increases in Hungary, for instance, number of days striked. But overall, this is still at a very low level. Where we see strikes in connection to collective bargaining is obviously only the countries where you have a substantial collective bargaining on wages going on. And one example is Austria, my home country, where usually there is a zero strike statistic nearly every year. And in the context of wage bargaining, in the context of inflation, this has increased in the past year. And we also saw it, as Ricardo mentioned, anecdotally in some countries with very strong unions in the public sectors. Slovenia, Finland, Portugal, major strikes. Then the other part I wanted to jump on was also completely in agreement with what Ricardo has said. The long-term tendency in wage setting was to move away from indexation mechanisms and automatic indexation mechanisms. So when we think about the last crisis, the economic recession, the Great Recession, they have really come under a lot of pressure from, especially from the EU level, with the country-specific recommendations that were given to the countries with automatic indexation mechanisms. No major reforms have happened. The other reforms that have happened that Ricardo alluded to happened already a long time ago. That was in Spain, in Italy, that had abolished automatic indexation in collective agreements. In the other countries, that didn't happen. And I had exactly the same question going into now this inflationary period. What will happen to automatic indexation mechanisms? Will they again start to be promoted? And to be honest, I've also not seen that picking up. It's more that I think the negotiators need to be really mindful about how to address inflation. On the company benefits,
okay, and Tadas, maybe quickly, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, on the company,
I want to come back on the company's benefits. So go ahead, Christine.
So what I wanted to say on that one is that we did see in a number of countries that governments supported companies to provide additional ad hoc payments by giving them reduced, by putting them under a reduced taxation scheme. So tax reliefs if companies paid out additional benefits to workers. So there was a major scheme, for instance, in Germany. Also, I think Austria used a similar tool that they had used in the COVID pandemic as a reaction, where companies could pay bonuses to workers, and those were taxation-wise preferentially treated. And this obviously increases the net that workers get. And I think it's, from the company perspective, a good tool, because it's, on the one hand, it's voluntary for companies, so not every company has to do that, but those that can pay more can do so more, and it does put less pressure on average wages, right? Like on the collective bargaining agreement outcomes. So yes, in that sense, I think it's a good tool. Yeah, that's as much as I can say on the question.
And Tadas, a quick word on how we know that businesses are responding to this.
I just wanted to briefly invite to make use of Eurofund's database, the European Restructuring Monitor, that may not tell exactly about a link between rising wages and companies' performance, but shows the general trend in job creation or job destruction. And what we saw in 21 and 22, that there have been considerably more jobs being created in the European Union than jobs lost. In 23, we see a change of this pattern. The numbers are becoming much more even. So it could be that the times are changing, but it's important to see that we have some reason to have confidence. Businesses were growing, even though we would be reading stories about big dismissals in the media. So everyone knows anecdotes, but let's not lose out of sight big trends that have been quite positive so far.
Okay, I want to try and fit in a couple more questions also now before we're coming to the end. But there is a question that came in here on are workers working longer hours in order to deal with the declining purchasing power? Does inflation have an impact on working time in that way? And what I really wanted to kind of bring that into a bigger question, if that's possible, Ricardo, not so much on the direct response to that, but the issue of wages in the current climate of inflation in collective bargaining processes. Is this taking precedence over other issues that would normally be part of the collective bargaining process, such as working time or adapting to digitalization, etc.? Do you find that it's coming to the fore more so?
Found this evidence of that. So, of course, in 2022, basically the wages have become more contentious in collective bargaining rounds. So that's quite clear, because inflation was really hitting a lot the wages. But despite of that, we cannot say. So there is no other topics, important topics, as for example, working time, which is a crucial one. Along with wages, working time is the most contentious and important topic to be negotiated usually. So we have not found that other relevant topics have been. For example, in the cases that we have analyzed, in the sector we have analyzed, there are some concerning provisions regarding job classifications, vocational training, even working time. So those topics are related to green transition or digital transition are, of course, less important in 2022, but
okay. And on the particular question there on our workers working longer hours, Tadas, maybe you could give us a few words just on your insights there.
the working hour development is somewhat paradoxical and really puzzles researchers and economists now. So the working hours on average only came back to the pre-pandemic level for the workers in high-skilled jobs, basically for highly educated and skilled workers. And it's not fully answered yet why and what it means that the working hours have not bounced back to the pre-pandemic level for a number of social and worker groups in the labor force. And that's a tendency noticed in the EU, but also in the USA. So there's something there to keep an eye on, and different factors have been brought up into consideration. One of them is labor hoarding. So big companies try to keep their labor force without dismissing, even if they couldn't provide full or more employment, vis-a-vis, labor shortages challenge. The other thing to explore is potentially a rising productivity, for which we need better measures to develop. Again, a number of questions that Eurofound might look into. We didn't go yet into advertising some of our ongoing research that relates to questions made in the chat, which were very, very much to the point.
Well, I think specifically here with respect to working time, I should draw anyone who is interested their attention to the fact that we're working intensively on the issue of working time, and we'll have several outputs both this year and next year in terms of delving into working time and the development of it, where we're working closely with the European Commission and others. And of course, most of the topics which are raised here, there's much more information on them available elsewhere. But perhaps we're coming to 10 minutes before time, and I do want to just get one kind of final question in here, because we did talk about the labour shortages aspect here, and maybe I can go back a little bit here to Ricardo. I mean, what the role that you referred to earlier, what role do labour shortages actually play here in terms of, will they help workers and unions to gain more bargaining power? Can this help in this inflationary context? Very briefly, if you can, before we go to the takeaways.
Yeah, well, definitely labour shortages is a new driver in collective bargaining. Particularly in the post-pandemic period, we have found this in the sectoral collective agreements that we have analyzed. Clearly, at least as last year, it was in the services sector, because probably following the aftermath of the pandemic, there in some specific sectors, HoReCa, hospitality, we have found these gaps, this mismatch in labor market particularly. But also in, for example, maybe more anecdotal, but in Italy with the domestic work, we have also found this. So I think that more and more, so first of all, in all sectors, labor shortages and skill shortages are concerns of both employers, of course, but also of trade unions and worker representatives, and still will be an issue in the coming years. That's for sure. We will stay, of course, with a lot of differences across sectors and across occupations too.
And of course, the link which we're very keen on ensuring that is a message that comes from Eurofound and all the work that we're doing on quality of jobs and working conditions more broadly, the link between labour shortages and those sectors that are facing some shortages. It can also be about the quality of those jobs in those sectors and improving working conditions to improve them so that we can fill those gaps. So we've covered a lot of bases today, and I'm conscious that we could go on for another hour. So thank you all for your input there. We've looked at the different mechanisms. We've looked at the collective bargaining and wage setting in progress. We see that it doesn't reach all workers. Particularly, we're looking there at the lower income groups, which can be most affected. We've looked at the minimum wages, which have increased, but still, and they haven't, impacted too much on the purchasing power, but still, it is a mechanism that could be looked at again to ensure that it keeps up with inflation at these times. We've looked at governments and how they've had to address this in terms of their social spending, assistance and benefits, and how they can target best the needs. And also, I suppose, we also have talked about this in the bigger context of so many other things going on, Russia's aggression and the war in Ukraine. We've looked at the green transition impacts, the just transition, digital, and of course also labor shortages, as we just mentioned there. So clearly, you know, what's coming through a lot here is that inflation is not happening in isolation. It has all of this as a framework. So, I mean, not to dwell too much on all of these issues, but if you were to have sort of a main takeaway that, you know, looking at a policymaker in the eyes, what would be the main point that you would make in the context of this broad-ranging topic that we've done today? Perhaps I can go to Ricardo first.
Well, I'm not sure to policymakers, but at least to negotiating parties, because it's about collective bargaining. But certainly, if we have this context of inflation is back, but also is going to stay for a while, at least over the coming years, that's for sure, then it suggests that respecting the autonomy of the social partners, I think that it's needed that the negotiating parties should find a way to include some kind of additional mechanism to enable workers to recovery and, of course, to sustain purchasing power, particularly the low wage groups. And this mechanism, of course, should be balanced in order to avoid any risk of wage price spirals and so on. That's my main take. So the negotiating parties should really find a way to balance and to find a mechanism to compensate that.
Very concise. Thank you, Ricardo. Christine, what would be your main takeaway?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I think I have a more technical takeaway. When we think about low wage earners or also low income households, they have to spend a much higher share of their income, especially on the basic necessities, food, energy, housing. So I think when we're looking at their purchasing power, it's so important to realize what is exactly the exposure to these price developments, to inflation, and that this is really taken into account. And my policy point would be that instead of looking at average inflation, you know, which we have readily available, countries could think about how to calculate inflation for these low-income households and for the low-wage workers. So look at which typical basket of goods and services do they consume with their available budget, and then see how have prices developed for this budget.
Okay.
So that's
thank you. Not too technical. That was good. Tadas, finally, in 2 minutes.
Just to echo further what Christina said, we realize that rising cost of living affect families of the workers and many social groups beyond employment. So in addition to monetary mechanisms, fair wages and so on, social assistance, it's important to ensure that support is targeted to the most deprived and the cost barrier doesn't get in the way of accessing key public services, from healthcare to schools, to care services, but also essential services. Another winter is coming, and it's important that preventive measures are put in place to assist those most deprived so that evictions, cut-offs from energy or other essential services are avoided.
Thank you, Tadas. Thank you, Tadas and Christine, Ricardo. Those were excellent, I think, rounding up the very rich discussion that we've had today. I would like also to thank those who have participated and contributed to today's discussion. Thank you for your questions, which allowed us to delve a little bit deeper into some of the issues which were raised. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being on social media. You can continue to follow up on the information and the topics that you have heard us discuss today. All of our information is available on our website, eurofoundeuropa.eu. Of course, we have other webinars which are recorded and will be online, as will this one be. You can sign up to our corporate newsletter, which is monthly. You can also check out our podcasts, which also are on Spotify or wherever you receive your podcasts. And we would be delighted to see you again at any or all of our upcoming webinars, which will take place down the line. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, and I wish you a very good day.